There is a gorge in western Scotland where the oaks grow sideways out of the rock. Every branch is wrapped in moss so thick it doubles the width of the limb. Lichens hang from the canopy like wet hair. Ferns sprout from the crooks of branches 10 meters off the ground, and liverworts coat every boulder in a skin of green so vivid it looks backlit. The air is heavy, saturated, and the light that reaches the floor has been filtered through so many layers of living tissue that it arrives as something closer to mist than sunshine. This is a temperate rainforest, and it is British. The climate that produces this, Atlantic weather systems rolling in year-round, mild winters with almost no frost, air so wet it rarely drops below saturation, once covered roughly a fifth of Britain's land surface. Around 4.6 million hectares of this woodland stretched from Cornwall to the Scottish Highlands, clinging to every west-facing slope and river gorge the ocean could reach. Today, less than 1% of Britain's land still holds it. More than 98% of the original forest is gone. The question is not why the forest is rare. The question is how an entire country forgot it had rainforests at all. The answer is an 800-year mechanical failure, a cascade where each phase of destruction made the next one worse, and where every generation adapted to a slightly barer version of the same landscape until the absence became invisible. The fix, when it finally came, did not begin with planting a tree. It began with drawing a map. When the system worked, it was self-reinforcing at every level. The canopy, sessile oak, birch, hazel, holly, intercepted Atlantic rainfall and slowed it. The immense weight of moss draped across every surface acted like a sponge, holding water in the canopy for hours before releasing it downward. The soil beneath was deep and laced with fungal networks that had been building connections for nearly 10,000 years. Research from the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew has traced unbroken underground fungal linkages in Scottish hazelwoods stretching back to the retreat of the last ice sheet, a resource-sharing web older than agriculture itself. The forest floor was a nursery. Acorns dropped into crevices between boulders slick with liverwort and germinated in soil kept permanently moist by the layers above. Saplings grew in the dappled gaps left by fallen veterans. The cycle replaced itself continuously, not through any single mechanism, but because every component supported every other component. Roots held soil, soil held water, water fed roots, moss held humidity, humidity fed moss. The first break was not dramatic, it was incremental. Beginning in the Bronze Age and accelerating through the medieval period, the canopy was felled for farmland, charcoal, shipbuilding timber, and the tanning industry, which stripped oak bark at industrial scale. No single generation saw the full picture. A farmer in the 14th century cleared a hillside his grandfather had already thinned. A charcoal burner in the 17th century worked a valley that had once been deep forest and was now open scrub with a few veteran trees. Each generation started from a slightly lower baseline and accepted it as normal. By the end of the industrial era, the continuous canopy that had once stretched from Devon to Sutherland was broken into hundreds of disconnected pieces. The forest had not been destroyed in one act. It had been shaved away, century by century, until most of it was simply gone, and nobody alive could remember what it had looked like whole. That forgetting was not incidental. It was itself a form of damage. Every generation that accepted the barer landscape as the natural state of Britain made the next round of clearing easier to justify and harder to notice. The physical loss and the cultural blindness compounded each other. But clearance alone did not trap the system. A cleared hillside can regrow. What came next made sure it couldn't. Without canopy cover, rain hit exposed soil at full force and ran straight off. Water that once soaked through root networks cut channels instead. The channels deepened, the soil thinned. Within decades, the ground compacted into a hardened skin that repelled moisture rather than absorbing it. Even if every axe had been put down, the forest could not simply grow back. The soil it needed was already washing downhill. And then came the pressure that sealed the ground for good. Post-war agricultural policy paid farmers per head of livestock, and across the uplands of Wales, England, and Scotland, stocking densities climbed. At the same time, centuries of predator eradication, wolves gone by the 17th century, lynx long before that, had removed every natural brake on wild deer populations. The combined grazing pressure was total. Any oak seedling that pushed above the moss was found within days and eaten to the ground. Any hazel shoot that tried to extend a woodland edge was clipped back before it reached knee height. A forest that cannot reproduce is a forest on a timer. The existing veteran trees, some of them 3, 4, 500 years old, continued to stand, continued to host their communities of lichens and mosses. But nothing was coming up beneath them. The woodland aged but could not replace itself. When those veterans eventually died, they would leave behind bare hillside, not young forest. The grazing pressure had not killed the woodland, it had sterilized it. And because the remaining fragments could no longer expand outward, they became vulnerable to something that could push inward. Between 1919 and the 1980s, the Forestry Commission operated under a national mandate to produce timber fast. The tool was the non-native conifer, Sitka spruce, lodgepole pine, species that grow quickly in wet conditions and can be harvested in decades rather than centuries. Thousands of hectares of ancient broadleaf woodland were clear-felled and replanted with dense conifer rows. Walk into one of these plantations and the difference is immediate. Where there should be dappled light filtering through oak leaves onto moss-covered boulders, there are dark, silent corridors of identical trunks. Acidic needle litter carpets the floor. Nothing grows in it. The fungal networks that spent millennia building connections through the native soil were stripped out and replaced with chemistry suited to a different continent entirely. These plantations did not just replace the rainforest, they occupied its exact footprint, the same slopes, the same soils, the same climatic envelope. The land most suitable for temperate rainforest was now growing Sitka spruce. Into this already fractured, already sterilized, already overwritten landscape came an invader perfectly designed to finish the job. Rhododendron ponicum arrived in Britain in the 1760s as a garden ornamental for country estates. It was exotic, evergreen, and spectacularly flowering. It had also evolved in a climate almost identical to the British rainforest zone, wet, mild, frost-free. Once it escaped the gardens, it found conditions so perfectly suited to its biology that it spread without limit. The plant forms dense evergreen thickets that block all sunlight from the forest floor. Its leaf litter is toxic to native seedlings. Its root system poisons the surrounding soil, and it carries a water mold that attacks and kills nearby native trees. In a healthy, continuous rainforest, the invasion might have been slowed by the sheer density of established native canopy. But the rainforest was no longer healthy or continuous. It was fragmented, grazed bare at the edges, weakened from the inside by conifers. The rhododendron moved into the gaps, filled the margins, colonized the understory of degraded woodlands, and sealed the remaining fragments shut. The next blow was invisible. Ammonia from intensive agriculture and nitrogen oxides from vehicle exhausts had changed the chemistry of the air itself. Most plants shrug this off. They feed through their roots. But the organisms that define a temperate rainforest, the lichens, the mosses, the liverworts, have no roots at all. They drink the air directly. And by the 2020s, 95% of UK woodlands exceeded safe limits for nitrogen deposition. The species that made the rainforest a rainforest were being chemically erased by pollution, drifting in from hundreds of kilometers away. Every previous pressure had come from outside. Axes, teeth, roots, chemistry. The last one came from the damage itself. Each remaining fragment was now too small, too isolated, too degraded to function as part of a connected system. Specialist lichens that disperse over decades had no corridor to travel. Organisms like the horsehair lichen, a thread-thin species now restricted to just 2 known sites, had no means of reaching new canopy, even if that canopy existed. Fungi that migrate through linked root networks had no roots left to link. Genetic diversity within each fragment narrowed with every generation. The fragments were no longer pieces of a forest. They were biological islands, each one slowly running down its own reserves. The original 4.6 million hectares had been reduced to roughly 63,000, scattered in hundreds of isolated patches, many smaller than a city park. A comprehensive survey of Welsh rainforest sites assessed 68 fragments, not one rated in very good condition. And the ratchet had turned so slowly across 800 years, across 40 human generations, that the country had simply stopped seeing what was missing. Bare hills became heritage landscape, sheep-cropped grass became natural moorland, conifer blocks became countryside. The absence was not merely unnoticed, it was actively protected and fiercely loved. An entire nation had built its sense of landscape beauty on the wound. The first step toward reversing the cascade was not planting a tree, removing a rhododendron bush, or culling a deer. It was proving that the patient still existed. In 2020, an environmental researcher named Guy Shrubsole relocated to Devon and began walking the steep, tangled gorges of the Southwest. What he found? Oaks draped in moss, boulders coated in liverworts, ferns growing from branches in gorges nobody had surveyed, did not match any map. The fragments were not cataloged as rainforest. Many were not cataloged as anything. They were dismissed as scrub, wet woodland, marginal land. The biome had no name in policy, no line item in any budget, no strategy from any government. Shrubsole launched a crowdsourced mapping effort and, in 2022, published a book that did one precise thing. It called the fragments what they were: temperate rainforest, not wet woodland, not Atlantic oakwood, rainforest. It connected a scattered collection of unnamed gorges and neglected hillsides to a global category, one of the rarest habitat types on Earth, covering less than 1% of the planet's land surface. Suddenly, the surviving fragments were not marginal British scrub. They were globally significant remnants of something almost gone. Within 18 months of that publication, England, Scotland, and Wales had each produced their first ever national strategy for temperate rainforest recovery. The biome went from having no policy identity to having 3 government frameworks in under 2 years. That sequence: mapping, naming, and arguing the biome into existence as a category that money and law could attach to, was the diagnostic insight. The fragments had to be rediscovered before they could be repaired, but a map does not remove the rhododendron choking the gorges. Across the Scottish Highlands, Forestry and Land Scotland pioneered a technique where workers drill directly into the stem of each rhododendron bush and inject a calibrated dose of herbicide into the plant's own transport system. The chemical travels down to the roots and kills the entire organism from within, without spraying surrounding soil or harming the sensitive lichens on adjacent trees. This replaced the old method of chainsawing, which merely triggered aggressive regrowth from the rootstock. The plant's defense mechanism turned against every previous attempt to remove it. The same principle applies to conifer plantations sitting on ancient woodland sites, where non-native trees are being systematically extracted and the ground beneath returned to native broadleaf regeneration. In Wales, the Celtic Rainforest Project has treated over 500 hectares of invaded woodland using the same targeted approach. But clearing rhododendron from a gorge means nothing if every seedling that follows is immediately eaten. Wild deer are being managed through coordinated culling across entire river catchments rather than site by site. Livestock are being excluded from regeneration zones through fencing, or in some cases replaced with animals whose grazing behavior actually helps the forest. Highland cattle and ponies that trample bracken and break compacted soil without stripping every emerging sapling. The goal is not to remove all herbivores. It is to drop the pressure below the threshold where young trees can survive their first decade. With the killing forces removed and the grazing pressure dropped, the remaining fragments can hold their ground. But holding ground is not enough when the fragments are too small and too far apart to function as a connected system. Some of the gap is being closed by conventional planting, saplings going into the ground around Wistman's Wood on Dartmoor to double the footprint of that iconic 4-hectare remnant. 300,000 trees planned for Skiddaw in the Lake District, where the Cumbria Wildlife Trust purchased 3,000 acres of upland specifically to restore Atlantic rainforest on its lower slopes. But much of the target land is too steep, too remote, or too dangerous for human planners. In late 2023, heavy-lift drones carrying nearly 60 kilograms of seed were deployed over Bodmin Moor, scattering 75,000 native seeds across 11 hectares of inaccessible ravines in 8 hours. The seeds, oak, alder, birch, hazel, wild cherry, were coated in clay and sawdust pellets so that a tiny birch seed would fall at the same rate as a heavy acorn, ensuring even distribution from the air. None of this holds if the funding disappears in 3 years. Government grants run for 3 to 5 years. An oak rainforest takes a century or more to close its canopy. That mismatch has strangled every previous restoration effort. The structural answer is carbon finance. In 2023, the insurance company Aviva committed £38.9 million to a 100-year rainforest restoration program targeting over 1,700 hectares across the British Isles. The growing forest absorbs atmospheric carbon, generating verified credits that justify the investment over a century. Regulated carbon codes allow individual landowners to replace grazing income with long-term payments for growing native woodland, redirecting the economics of the uplands away from bare hillside and toward forest. These are not separate projects. They are one machine. Removing rhododendron without controlling deer produces seedlings that get eaten. Controlling deer without expanding the fragments produces isolated patches too small to sustain their own humidity. Expanding without long-term finance produces a decade of growth followed by abandonment. The same interlocking logic that destroyed the rainforest, each pressure compounding the next, is now being engineered to run in reverse. The loop has been identified. The first components are being replaced. But the machine will take centuries to fully restart. The numbers that exist are real and early. Forestry and Land Scotland treated 1,226 hectares of rhododendron in the 2024 to 25 season alone, 41% above their target, part of a wider 11,000 hectare clearance effort across the Scottish rainforest zone. In Wales, 540 hectares of invaded woodland were treated through the Celtic Rainforests project. Borrowdale's 721 hectares of ancient rainforest were declared a National Nature Reserve in May 2024. The Skiddaw purchase went through. The first 450 saplings at Wistman's Wood are in the ground. On the Isle of Rassay, community-led teams achieved rhododendron clearance above 90% across 160 hectares. In newly opened zones across the Highlands, botanists are already recording suppressed lichens and mosses expanding across forest floors that had not seen sunlight in decades. These are genuine gains. They are also a fraction of what is required. The 75,000 seeds scattered over Bodmin Moor are pellets in bare soil. They need years to become saplings, decades to become trees, and a century or more to become forest. The lichens that define the biome disperse so slowly they may take generations to colonize new canopy, assuming the corridors between fragments are built in time. A 2024 climate study added a dimension nobody had originally planned for. Modeling published in the journal Earth's Future projected that unmitigated warming could make up to 68% of the world's remaining temperate rainforests too hot and dry to survive by 2100. Forests in the Americas, and the Southern Hemisphere overheating beyond recovery. But Britain, buffered by the Atlantic, kept wet and mild by ocean currents, sits inside one of the most stable remaining zones on the planet. A country holding less than 0.25% of the Earth's land surface possesses the conditions to support between 6 and 9% of the world's future viable temperate rainforest habitat. A domestic restoration effort is becoming, by accident of geography, a global refuge for an entire biome. That is the honest position. The ratchet turned one way for 800 years. It has been turning back for roughly 3. The feedback loop that destroyed the forest, clearing enabling grazing, grazing enabling invasion, invasion enabling fragmentation, fragmentation enabling collapse, has a mechanical reverse. Remove the invader, reduce the grazing, bridge the gaps, secure the finance. Let the forest close its own canopy, hold its own humidity, grow its own replacements. But an oak planted today will not reach maturity for 200 years. The moss that should drape its branches has not begun to grow. The lichens that will one day hang from those mossy limbs exist right now on the bark of trees that were old before the Industrial Revolution. The people doing this work, drilling herbicide into rhododendron stems on Scottish hillsides, flying drones over Cornish ravines, fencing saplings against deer in Welsh valleys, will never see the finished forest. Their grandchildren probably will not either. That is not a limitation of the project, that is the engineering specification. 1/5 of Britain was rainforest. Less than 1/100th still is. The machine broke slowly enough that an entire nation forgot what it was looking at. The repair will take just as long. But for the first time in 8 centuries, the ratchet is turning the other way. If the mechanics of how landscapes break and how they get rebuilt is something you want to understand, subscribe. There is more to build.